Thank you. After that introduction, I don't have to say anything. I'd like to thank Jessica and the organizing committee for allowing me to participate in this wonderful conference, and I hope it's the first of many in Canada. It's also very auspicious because this is my last conference paper as a professor who is actually employed, since I am retiring in 2 months and will settle into what I hope is a normal life. So I guess you could say in some ways this is my swan song, not to be confused with That Swan. For those of you that know the field a little bit, The Swans Came to Canada Too is a play on my friend Rick Field's popular book, How the Swans Came to the Lake, A Narrative History of Buddhism in America. And I guess before I start, I should say, I don't get it with all the bird stuff. The swans came to the lake, wild geese, Buddhism in Canada. For a dog person like me, I was almost tempted to call this paper, Barking Beagles, Growling Goldens, Is North American Buddhism Going to the Dogs? So we'll see. Anyway, I promised John Harding that I would not do more than an hour, so hopefully I will hold to that. The beginning of this paper is called Finding American Buddhism. In 1974, during the first summer of Naropa Institute, Rick Fields and I had many conversations about our respective books on American Buddhism. Of course, neither of us had yet written a word, but we each had elaborate plans for what we hoped to achieve. The chief complaint that we both shared was that it was immensely difficult to find, contact, and continue tracking North American Buddhist communities. The internet was a long way off, and that left mostly telephone contact, the postal service, and personal visits for information gathering. Rick had an edge, too, because as a journalist, and especially one who was a close disciple of Chogyam Trungpa, he had an in that I, as a mere scholar, didn't have. Moreover, Rick was a great writer, and I was always a bit envious of his magnificent prose, which read far better than the turgid Buddhist hybrid English that we Buddhologists used. It was hard to gauge and keep track of North American Buddhist communities, but at least the landscape then was still very tiny. Although I never really made an attempt in those early days to actually count the number of North American Buddhist communities, a good retrospective guess might be no more than 100 at the very most. By the time Don Morial compiled his book Buddhist America, Centers, Retreats, and Practices in 1988, there were about 500 Buddhist groups in America, and about twice that a decade later when he published the updated version called The Complete Guide to Buddhist America. Morial wasn't wrong when he titled his introductory chapter in this later volume, Everything Has Changed in Buddhist America. Now a quick look at the World Buddhist Directory at www.buddhanet.net shows more than 2,500 Buddhist groups in North America, with California serving as home to more than 400 Buddhist groups. Florida, Illinois, and New York have over 100, and British Columbia and Ontario aren't far behind, with 92 and 90, respectively, as of this writing, which was during the summer. While Rick Fields and I relied on personal visits, telephone calls, and so forth, Rick and I were actually lucky because we got to meet the famous Asian teachers who were coming in clusters to North American soil. It was great fun to meet these people early in their American mission when many of them were creating the North America Dharma as they went. And Rick's style of investigation was very different than mine because, as noted above, he was a well-known journalist and a Trungpa student. He had inroads to places many other investigators didn't have, and that provided him with an immense fund of data. In addition, Rick was mostly interested in the convert communities and their meditative practices, sometimes overlooking Asian American communities whose practices were far removed from meditation. When I went to visit Buddhist communities, I tried as hard as I could to be invisible. Instead of plugging myself as a scholar, and I had not yet invented the term scholar practitioner, I was quiet and just mingled with the community members. And I tried hard to focus on the entire Buddhist community in North America, not just the converts who practice meditation. My rationale was by just hanging out, I got more reliable and less measured responses. I felt this approach gave me a real sense of what was going on in the communities I visited. Not to overlook one of the critical factors involved in these early fieldwork studies, I got to meet the famous teachers too, but in a different way than Rick did. It was exciting. Trungpa, Tartang Tulku, Suzuki Roshi, they were all real and accessible to all their community members. Rick and I also got to meet their Western disciples who eventually became their Dharma heirs. The above shouldn't be taken as a rejection of the internet, as it's now very helpful to use that resource to collect lots of information prior to visiting Buddhist centers. Some of the websites are incredibly sophisticated and comprehensive. My best guess, for example, is that if one actually printed out all the pages from all the links on the website of Zen Mountain Monastery, there would be several hundred pages of hard copy print telling you everything and anything you might want to know about ZMM. Yet the internet does lead to some awkward circumstances for researchers. Some of this will be a little weird, so you have to bear with me. In a review of one of my books, a young, then graduate student named Clark Hudson, working under Jan Nadir, claimed that I never visited Shilai Temple in Hacienda Heights, California, and that I gathered all my information from the internet. That's pretty libelous stuff to say, and he didn't actually know where I did and didn't go. The fact is, I spent many visits at the Fo Kwang Shan Temple in Mississauga in Ontario in 97 and 98 during my research year in Canada. I did indeed visit the Shilai Temple in California and the Fo Kwang Shan Temple here in Richmond, British Columbia, just south of Vancouver. In fact, the British Columbia Temple, it turns out, is the only Buddhist temple I've ever gotten thrown out of in all my travels. After walking around the temple grounds, my wife and I walked into the majestic Buddha Hall. She hung out at the entrance while I properly prostrated myself in front of each of the large Buddha statues, and then I took out my camera and set about taking a few photos that I wanted to use in my books. Just as I started shooting photos, a young fellow who'd been working on a computer in the corner of the Buddha Hall came running over shouting at me, "No pictures, no pictures!" Politely, I asked why he didn't want me to take pictures, as I had actually been encouraged to do so in other Buddhist temples. He said simply, "Disrespectful to Buddha, disrespectful to Buddha," over and over again. Undaunted, I asked how my taking pictures of Buddha statues was disrespectful to Buddha, while his working on a computer in the corner wasn't. At that point, he said, "Now you get out, now you get out," and he grabbed my arm, picked up my wife along the way, and led us all the way through the whole temple grounds to our car in the parking lot, and he stood there in the parking lot until we actually left the temple grounds before he went back to his work. In any case, Clark Hudson wrote this review where he said I didn't visit all these temples after the book was 5 years in print, so I never could quite figure out why that all happened, and he never ever wrote anything on American Buddhism again, so it's kind of weird. My book, American Buddhism, wasn't published until 1979, and Rick Field's book, How the Swans Came to the Lake, appeared in 1981. But between our times together at Naropa and the publication of our books, there was one major and ambitious conference on Buddhism in North America, the 1977 Syracuse Conference on the Flowering of Buddhism in America, which may have been, at that point, a little overly ambitious in the title. The main organizer and keynote speaker was Professor Louis Nordstrom, a longtime Zen practitioner who's now a Roshi in the White Plum Asanga and leads the Brevard Zen Center in Florida. In his keynote talk, Nordstrom identified two categories of study in North American Buddhism: the scenery and the path. Nordstrom argued that studies focusing on the scenery of North American Buddhism, such as Emma Lehman's Buddhism in America, missed the target altogether, while studies concerning the path enhanced the Buddhist mission in North America. Nordstrom's statement was well-intended, and he was right about the early publications then and in the coming 20 years or so. To be starkly honest, my first book on the topic, and Rick's as well, necessarily described mostly the scenery of American Buddhism. We were simply too new to the task and too close to our surveys of the landscape and collecting what groups were operating on the scene to make much sense yet of the path. It would probably be fair, too, to say that the other fine books of the times that dealt mostly with the scenery. Yet, I think Nordstrom was really wrong. To fully understand Buddhist America and the developments of the past centuries of the North American continent, we need to understand both the scenery and the path. While a few of the edited volumes that have appeared over the past 2 decades have dealt with some of the issues impacting North America, there's virtually no thoroughness or completeness in any one volume. So why is it necessary for us to have some sort of typology or paradigm with which to study and investigate and measure the Buddhist community in North America? I think the answer is simple. Buddhism's presence in North America and its globalization in general has simply become immense. Buddhism's growth to more than 2,500 communities on the continent doesn't begin to reflect the complexity of the development of this expanding religious tradition. Now there are North American Buddhist titles on virtually every topic imaginable, establishing this literature as its own cottage industry. Conferences which aim to bring together scholars and practitioners alike are popping up regularly, like Naropa's recent conference sponsored by the Frederick P. Lenz Foundation for Buddhism in America, which was highlighted by a brilliant keynote address by Jan Willis entitled Dharma Diversity, the Many Forms and Faces of Buddhism in America. And perhaps the most telling sign of Buddhism's acceptance and complexity on the North American scene is the dozens of university courses devoted to North American Buddhism. All of the above move beyond the simplistic image of Hollywood Buddhists or celebrity Buddhists and point in the direction of genuine Buddhist literacy developing here. At least one author has suggested that we consider English as the newest canonical language. And another scholar, Stephen Berkowitz, has cleverly and maybe even properly suggested that rather than having our students begin their studies of North American Buddhism with the fine academic textbooks that are now available, they instead should read the primary sources of American Buddhism, books by the Asian Buddhist masters who appeared on the American scene interpreting the Buddhist tradition for willing North Americans. This next part of the paper is called A North American Buddhist Typology. So is there anything out there that makes sense of this complex tradition? Is there anything that tells us how we might approach our studies of North American Buddhism in this new subdiscipline in the larger field of Buddhist studies? I think there is. When Kenneth Tanaka and I edited The Faces of Buddhism in America, we settled on 5 major thematic issues: ethnicity, practice, democratization, engagement, and adaptation. I expanded a consideration of these topics in my book Luminous Passage and framed the discussion between 2 bookends of who is a Buddhist and ecumenicism. To my knowledge, no other scholar beside Franz Metcalf in a little-known 2006 article has suggested anything as comprehensive, thorough, and still applicable as we move into the 21st century. Franz's list included, similarly, convert Buddhism, lay Buddhism, meditational Buddhism, engaged Buddhism, non-sexist Buddhism, democratic Buddhism, psychological Buddhism, and ecumenical Buddhism. Why do I think my typology continues to offer the most promising paradigm for understanding North American Buddhism? No matter where one goes, the discussion always focuses on these issues. Virtually every one of the 24 papers presented at the Buddhism Without Borders conference at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley in March 2010 dealt with these issues. It's the same at panels at the on North American Buddhism at the American Academy of Religion annual meetings or the IABS. The insightful and well-prepared new scholars of North American Buddhism are now publishing lots of exciting articles on the development of North American Buddhism, yet they're still trapped in the scenery that Nordstrom cited and have not offered any new creative ways of understanding the path or the whole development of Buddhism on this continent. To see what I mean, we need to move on to a consideration of that 5-fold typology from Luminous Passage and see what it really holds now for understanding Buddhist America. The first bookend that I proposed for my 1990 typology, 1999, of how we determine who is a Buddhist, I had discussed my own notion of self-identification 20 years earlier in American Buddhism. People had a hard time accepting the notion that a Buddhist in America is someone who simply says, "I am a Buddhist," when discussing their perhaps most important personal pursuit. At that time, and prior to my postulate, I struggled with a long string of other possible choices. Does taking refuge establish Buddhist identity? How about membership in a Buddhist community? Does attending meditation sessions regularly or irregularly make one a Buddhist? Does donating money to a Buddhist community give one Buddhist identity? What about regular attendance at temple services? The possible list could go on, and so could the various combinations. Yet no one standard or combination would work for everyone. And there are other problems too. Jan Nadir was quick to point out that Americans are notorious non-joiners. Some very devout practitioners might simply choose to engage in Buddhist practice singularly as a Sangha of one. By arguing that self-identification was a sane resolution for identifying North American Buddhists, I argued that it allowed North American Buddhists to abandon our attachment to a ritual formulary that is neither workable nor widely followed. I took a proverbial beating for my definition, but 2 decades later, once Tom Tweed suggested my idea as if it was new, and his to boot, we have a name for that, it became and remains the standard today. Now we don't have to wrestle with silly labels like nightstand Buddhists, sympathizers, adherents, cradle Buddhists, and a host of others that created a lot of clever discussion, but no real resolution. A Buddhist is someone who simply says, "I am a Buddhist." Perhaps an interesting sidelight to this question is that can one maintain multiple affiliations? Can one be both a Buddhist and a Jew, or a Buddhist and a Christian? Many people would clearly maintain they could. A very interesting recent doctoral dissertation by Nicole Liebman, who's in the audience tonight, at the University of Calgary, was titled "The Choosing People: Constructing Jewish-Buddhist Identity in America." Most people studying American Buddhism sooner or later read Roger Kamenitz's book, The Jew and the Lotus, published in 1994, and most are aware that there's a high number of Jewish converts to Buddhism. Part of Nicole's study involved individuals who responded to a survey she did, and while many identified themselves as both Buddhist and Jewish, they did not consider Buddhism a religion. What does that mean? We'll leave that one aside because that's not part of the topic for tonight, but you can ask Nicole later. Now that mostly everyone seems to agree on the definition, we don't need to maintain that issue as a bookend to my fivefold typology. I've got a newer one and a better one, although it's not my own creation. It was suggested, in fact, by one of the finest young minds in the study of North American Buddhism, Jeff Wilson. In an article titled "Mapping the American Buddhist Terrain, Paths Taken and Possible Itineraries," and posted on 21 September 2009 in the online journal Religion Compass, Wilson suggested that we haven't paid much attention to borders and boundaries as we've investigated North American Buddhism, while the erstwhile investigators of other religions on the continent have used geographic studies to significantly aid their understanding of those traditions. Wilson gave a stirring exposition of his regionalism theory at the Buddhism Without Borders conference, and this was no simplistic presentation. He didn't focus only on the differences between Americans in different parts of the United States and on rural versus metropolitan areas. He covered the whole terrain. It may seem odd that nobody thought of that before Wilson, but they didn't. Wilson talked about the pragmatic differences within Buddhist sectarian communities based on their location. He wondered about the differences between various teachers within the same lineage, but who were located in different areas of the country. He also explored how such issues within regionalism as climate and terrain and environmental concerns impact various North American communities. And he was forthright in stating, quote, "We need to be careful about allowing a handful of the largest metropolitan areas in North America to stand in for the totality of Buddhist experience," unquote. I think this new bookend will offer a far better introduction to the considerations of the fivefold typology than mine did. My only concern is that in an overall technological environment of increasing social networking, within a decade or two, regionalism may lose its punch as rural Buddhists in Nova Scotia pick up the urban savvy of Toronto and city dwellers in San Francisco start to resonate with farm-living Buddhists in the Midwest. In other words, the next generation of North American Buddhists will be way beyond Facebook and Twitter and blogs. When I suggested this possibility to Jeff Wilson recently, his only comment was, "It won't happen." As Jeff walked away, I quietly and privately wondered if a decade or so down the road, he'd be saying to himself, "Gee, regionalism made so much sense in 2009 when I first proposed it, and when it was completely accurate. Why are scholars reading history backwards and attacking the original idea just because it's not applicable now?" Gee, that's what I said about my old two Buddhisms theory. Time will tell, but in the meantime, Jeff's given us a whole shopping cart of food for thought. Now, let's move on to the first of the five, ethnicity. Probably no issue has been more divisive in the practice and study of North American Buddhism than ethnicity. To be sure, the problem goes back more than a century from the Helen Tworkov and tricycle debacle of the early 1990s. When I first began visiting Buddhist sanghas in the United States in the early 1970s, there were only two kinds of Buddhist groups to be found. Communities of Asian American Buddhists, later to be called Asian Immigrant Buddhists by Paul Numrich. And within these communities, almost no white, black, or Hispanic faces were visible. On the other hand, there were communities dominated by what Numrich later called American Convert Buddhists, and within these communities, almost no Asian American, black, or Hispanic faces could be found. Scholars never used these terms in a racist sense at all. They were simply descriptive terms to catalog who went where. These two forms of community rarely, if ever, had any communication with one another. That's why I coined the phrase two Buddhisms in 1979. The phrase was meant to delineate one form of Buddhism, now called Asian Immigrant Buddhism, that placed primary emphasis on sound basic doctrines shared by all Buddhists and on solid religious practice. and another form of Buddhism, now called American Convert Buddhism, that seemed to emerge shortly after radical social movements, similar to what America had experienced in the 1950s and 60s. At the time, my intention was only to find a way for Asian immigrant Buddhists and American convert Buddhists to find a respectful and mutually enhancing way of relating and communicating together, and to find a way for scholars who studied these communities to properly and accurately have a terminology that applied to each community. I never imagined that I had given birth to what would become a 2-decade-long maelstrom of controversy. It wasn't long before Jan Nadir jumped into the fray, offering her 3 Buddhisms theory of import Buddhism, which she also called elite Buddhism, export Buddhism, also called evangelical Buddhism, and baggage Buddhism, also called ethnic Buddhism. And I must say that I think most ethnic Buddhists at that time really didn't like to be called baggage. Kenneth Tanaka at one point suggested to her to try to disarm it that maybe furniture would have been a better term, but I don't know if that's any better. 2 of these 3 categories had already been mentioned by American religion scholar Peter Williams in his 1990 book, American Religions, and by me in my Buddhist Studies Review article. So her theory wasn't all that original. Nadir was concerned more with the lines of transmission than ethnicity, and I often wondered if I had titled my original article 2 Buddhisms and 3 Lines of Transmission, whether the whole debate might never have emerged in the first place. Once the debate began, it raced ahead at breakneck speed, and it's still racing. For more than a half-decade, I have been listening to Shannon Wacko Hickey talk about ethnicity and racism in American Buddhism, and I truly share her concern that North American Buddhism and studies of North American Buddhism should not be racist or promote racism. Her insightful paper, 2 Buddhisms, 3 Buddhisms, and Racism, was presented first at the 2004 annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion in San Antonio, and it deftly reviewed all of the typologies for studying American Buddhism and more in depth, highlighting the many limitations of each theory. At the time, I admired her courage, for it took real tenacity on her part to make these statements with Paul Numrick and myself sitting in the audience, because she was attacking us. Almost 6 years later, at the Buddhism Without Borders conference in March 2010, Shannon presented what is now the final version of her paper. I think it's the 6th morph of this paper over 6 years. My disappointment is that the closest she ever came after all this time and all her complaining about existing typologies to offering an alternative was to suggest in less than 1 page 3 new categories. Offshoot groups, which emerge from the established groups, transplant groups, which represent established groups that move into a new environment, and new movements, or groups which are developed by someone not ordained by an established tradition. That's it, after 6 years. I don't mean to belittle Shannon Hickey, as I believe her thorough and insightful scholarship is part of the hopeful future of the subdiscipline of North American Buddhist studies. She's really quite brilliant. Yet she, like virtually all the current scholars, does little more than track the existing scholarship and criticize it. Of the 24 papers presented at that conference, for example, 3/4 of them focused to some degree on the 2 Buddhisms theory, and of course all rejecting it. Every one of them spoke about the necessity for moving beyond what they referred to as an unfortunate and even racist delineation, but almost nobody addressed how to do that. Worse still, they all engage in revisionist history and read the current inapplicability back into a time period when the 2 Buddhisms theory was absolutely accurate. Some of them even incorrectly cited the author of the theory to be Paul Numrick. If North American Buddhism has now outgrown the ethnic convert typology, and I do think it has, then where do we go from here? In other words, if the 2 Buddhism theory is so outdated and problematic, then there are two obvious possibilities. Either stop whining about it, and that, do I have that in here yet? Yeah. Whining about Buddhisms, that isn't considered to be a joke. Either stop whining about it and making it the focus of all these major conferences and move on to other issues or offer some new and better alternative theory. As best I can tell, the only person to suggest the start of defining a new way of understanding North American Buddhism is a young graduate student named Christine Walters. Walters' theory suggests abandoning the racial and or ethnic identity and establishing a new typology, and instead proffers the idea of employing denominationalism as the new yardstick for North American Buddhism. She further suggests employing specific religious identity and practice within denominations to further define Buddhist communities. Then, so as not to throw out the baby with the proverbial bathwater, She even suggested other typologies, like the old two Buddhisms theory, could be employed within denominations to help draw out distinctions. I don't know if the current generation of North American Buddhist scholars and practitioners will ever provide a meaningful new alternative that allows us to understand the role of ethnicity in a constructive and respectful fashion. I do, though, throw in my lot with Jan Willis when she recently noted, this is a quote, "Buddhism in America is incredibly diverse, both in terms of its forms and in terms of its practitioners. In trying to characterize these, scholars have come up with a number of typological models. But people and forms don't remain fixed forever. Change, after all, is a cardinal principle. And as Chuck Prebish recently told us, typologies are not set in stone." Gee, I really did say that. With generations on American soil behind them, ethnic Buddhists have become American Buddhists. It's too early to say how the challenges of diversity will play out here, though it would certainly be better if diversity and difference could be appreciated for the richness they bring rather than the divisions. Moving on, practice. The second item in my fivefold typology is practice. Many researchers, me included, have walked into North American Buddhist centers and begun their investigative inquiry with the question, "What's your practice?" The first time I asked that question was in a Buddhist Churches of America temple. The faithful and respectful Jodo Shinshu practitioner looked at me like I was crazy. She looked at me like I was absolutely foolish. And she never did answer. But as I watched her over the next several days, I learned that her identity as a Buddhist and her identity as a person were inseparable. In the nearly 40 years since that initial observation, my experience with Asian immigrant Buddhists has been almost identical to that initial meeting. On the other hand, when I visit North American convert sanghas, I always get an immediate and different response: meditation. Indeed, the specific form of meditation, such as Zen or Vipassana, varies, but the focus on meditation remains immediate. If I then push back a little and ask some specific questions about what other aspects of Buddhist practice they might do, there's usually very little response, almost as if Buddhism for them was a monolithic meditation jnana tradition. There's little doubt that the above reinforces some of the problems in understanding the distinctions that exist between Asian immigrant and American convert communities. And it's understandable, too. In his introductory chapter in Don Moriel's first catalog of American Buddhist centers, Jack Kornfield, one of the superstars on what I call the pro tour of North American Buddhism, indicated that a wonderful process was happening in North American Buddhism. He said, "American lay people are not content to go and hear a sermon once a week or to make merit by leaving gifts at a meditation center. We too want to live the realizations of the Buddha and bring them into our hearts, our lives, and our times." A decade later, when he was interviewed by Time magazine, Kornfield was even more direct. He said, "American people don't want to be monks or nuns. They want practices that transform the heart." Kornfield went on to explain, that is why so many convert Buddhists attend Vipassana retreats or Zen sesshin, and in so doing, he essentially dismissed the efficacy of all non-meditative traditions. We should bear in mind, too, that it's not only the ethnic Buddhist traditions that Kornfield omits in what he calls the real practice of the Buddha. He also eliminates Soka Gakkai as well, and that may well be the largest Buddhist tradition in terms of membership on the North American soil. You think that's still true now? He's the guy to ask, and I think it's true too. Kornfield is certainly correct when he defines North American Buddhism as an essentially lay Buddhist tradition. North America has never been a monastic culture, but to focus exclusively on the lay Buddhist tradition overlooks the immensely critical role Buddhist monastics have played throughout Buddhist history in Asia. Moreover, in its globalization, for the monastics, along with the scholar practitioners, remain the culture bearers of the tradition. It's no accident that 2 decades after Kornfield wrote his remarks, more and more monastic centers are growing up throughout North America. And an increasing number of American Buddhists, men and women alike, are choosing the monastic vocation as a means of making Buddhist practice the focal point in their lives. While this is no significant issue, it's not free from dilemmas, for the monastic codes for monks and nuns, known as the Vinaya, were largely written for a religious environment that's now more than 2 millennia old, and no longer entirely applicable in our modern and sometimes urban lifestyle. As a result, the codes themselves and the degree to which they are enforced become problematic. Many Western Buddhist monastic centers have had to incorporate many exceptions into the detailed rules, and my suspicion is it will be not much longer before the commentarial tradition, which died out 1,500 years ago, will be reawakened. Additionally, as early as the 1970s, Suzuki Roshi commented on the problematic of the choice between a lay and monastic life in America, noting that American students are not priests, yet not completely laymen. He went on to say, I think you are special people and want some special practice that is not exactly priest practice and not exactly a layman's practice. Lama Surya has actually called this alternative experience in this situation an in-between Sangha. And that really does make sense. Moving beyond the lay versus monastic dichotomy, it does seem that academic studies and popular books alike focus almost exclusively on the various meditative traditions. And in typical North American fashion, success is often measured quantitatively rather than qualitatively. The more hours in meditation practice, the better, irrespective of any measurable improvement in the religious or secular life of the practitioner. If one wants to know just how dominant the meditative tradition is in North America, all that's necessary is to peruse the pages of the front or back sections of Tricycle, or Shambhala Sun, or Buddha Dharma. One can even find places where the Buddhist tradition has blossomed into part of the wellness movement, thanks in part to the spectacular efforts of individuals like John Kabat-Zinn, who founded the Stress Reduction Clinic at the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. The choices available are far different and more comprehensive than during the Dharma-hopping explosions of the 1970s and 1980s. Nonetheless, if Lama Surya Das was correct when he identified the three jewels of North American Buddhism to be me, myself, and I, rather than Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, then perhaps the motive hasn't changed all that much. Instant enlightenment sounds pretty good. By no means does this rule out the serious, well-intentioned students who value Buddhist ideals and mental training, but it also recognizes that many North Americans still collect teachings and immediate gratification the way they collect baseball cards and songs on their iPods. More is better. I'm again reminded that my early students of Naropa Institute then were far more impressed to learn that I did 4 hours per day of sitting Satipatthana meditation and all-day sits on Sunday than they were with my academic credentials. Nobody ever asked me if I did anything in meditation. Maybe I engaged in erotic fantasies all that time. They wouldn't have cared. And it was no different more than 30 years later when the Cache Valley Sangha in Utah were very impressed to learn of my many hours on the cushion and my month-long retreats early in my training. But they turned off immediately when I explained that my major Buddhist practice no longer involved daily formal meditation. I've always enjoyed my time spent at Buddhist centers where the meditative tradition is properly integrated into an overall Buddhist lifestyle. But it was no accident that for my very first invitation to speak at a Zen Mountain Monastery retreat, Daido Roshi asked me to plan a weekend's lectures on precepts. There's no need, again, for me to rehearse here my staunch support for the precepts as practice approach to Buddhism. Yet I think it's important to understand that Buddhist communities, composed mostly of Asian immigrant Buddhists, value and utilize ritual practices, chanting, and faith-based observances in quite the same way convert communities emphasize sitting meditation. The mental focus and concentration required to carry out ritual practice in the proper fashion is every inch as demanding as shamatha meditation. But additionally, I think that the precepts as practice approach can additionally help bridge the gap between the Asian immigrant and American convert communities, because irrespective of the specific practice dictated by the individual sanghas, all Buddhists are obliged to follow the 5 vows of the lay practitioner. Those 5 vows are something we are all encouraged to do all the time. One cannot overestimate the importance of ethical concerns for the entire Buddhist community globally. In the more than 2,500 years since Buddha's ministry, the ethical concerns and challenges we face as global and American Buddhists have changed drastically. And we are indeed fortunate that scholars like Damien Keown have helped us better understand the contextual circumstances for issues that never occurred during Buddha's lifetime, like abortion, euthanasia, bioethics generally, sexual ethics, and the like. All of these issues fall under the category of practice, and they will continue to become more complicated as we move through this new century. What's rarely mentioned in discussing Buddhist practice is the issue of Buddhist family life. To the best of my knowledge, the only Buddhist publication that devotes a regular column to Buddhist family life and parenting is Turning Wheel, published by the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Fortunately, we now have books like Sandy Eastokes' volume called Dharma Family Treasures, Sharing Buddhism with Children, John and Mila Kabat-Zinn's book called Everyday Blessings, The Inner Work of Mindful Parenting. The issue of Buddhist parenting and family life cannot be overlooked because many of the young North American Buddhist converts and many of the latest generation of Asian immigrant Buddhists now find themselves having given birth to yet another generation of American Buddhists. One of these Dharma brats is Sumi London Kim, born into a small Soto Zen community in New Hampshire in 1975. Her interest in Buddhist family life prompted her to publish an edited book in 2001 called Blue Jean Buddha, Voices of Young Buddhists, with about 30 short sections written by young Buddhists. 5 years later, she followed up with the Buddhist Apprentices, More Voices of Young Buddhists. At the end of her second book, in a section called Looking Ahead, she tells her own story, addressing the issue of how to infuse Buddhist practice into the lives of our children. She wastes no time in raising the critical issue of practice. How are we, the greater Buddhist community in America, going to receive these beginners and young people? She postulates 3 things that might secure a sane Buddhist environment and practice for our future generation. First, she hopes the overall Buddhist community will create a welcoming atmosphere in individual Buddhist communities. Second, Buddhist communities need to create participatory roles designed to energize young people. Finally, and most importantly, Buddhist communities need to address the psychological needs of our youngsters. Is Sumi London's approach working? One of the contributors to her first book was Noah Levine, now notorious for his work with Dharma Punks, one of the most visible Buddhist organizations today, despite its very unusual focus and lots of tattoos. Another was Jimmy Yu, now a Buddhist studies professor in Florida. And still another was Venerable Yifa, a Fo Guangshan ordained nun since 1979. And perhaps the most notable of all of them was Jeff Wilson, identified earlier in this address as perhaps the brightest new voice in the study of North American Buddhism. Moving on to democratization. My suspicion is that most North American Buddhists would argue that the ancient Buddhist tradition was hardly a democratic organization. But parts of it, despite being profoundly patriarchal, were. A quick study of the Vinaya codes governing the monastic institution shows that the Sangha was profoundly democratic in dispensing its institutional function. Nonetheless, the ancient Buddhist community was also primarily hierarchical and highly authoritarian with respect to leadership roles, and that's what was transmitted to America. The recent movement towards democratization in the North American Buddhist community was hastened, as many people know, by a rather public series of scandals involving both Asian masters and the first generation of North American Buddhist teachers. The days in which North American Buddhist communities were headed by male Asian masters who had virtually unlimited authority are long gone. But early in their teaching mission here, these Asian masters passed on their lineages to a generation of Western successors. As such, there are second and even third generation Western Buddhist masters in the overall North American Sangha. Some writers have indicated there are now more female teachers in North America than males. The White Plum Sangha, which is a consortium of Zen communities in the lineage of Taizan Meizumi Roshi, lists nearly 100 teachers on its webpage at www.whiteplum.org, and approximately 40% of them are female. The same is true for Shambhala International, Chogyam Trungpa's network of communities. More importantly, many North American Buddhist Sanghas are now managed by a collective governing body. The San Francisco Zen Center, for example, recently restructured its abbacy, appointing a central abbot, a city center abbot, and a senior Dharma teacher for Green Gulch Farm. Moreover, they have a governing board of almost 24 members. This democratic pattern also now seems to be generally guided by the principle that Rita Gross referred to as natural hierarchy, in which community members simply work at those tasks that are most suited to their interests and abilities, irrespective of gender. This approach makes all roles valuable learning experiences. A final item that has moved North American Buddhism safely forward in the aftermath of the well-publicized teacher scandals of the 70s and 80s is a much tighter regulation on the conduct allowed between teachers and students in North American Buddhist communities. Also influenced by the changing pattern of authority in North American Buddhist communities is the changing impact gender roles have had on the same communities. While Rita Gross's important book, Buddhism After Patriarchy, spearheaded the issue of women's roles in post-patriarchal Buddhism generally, many other Buddhist women in both the lay and monastic communities have carried the issue aggressively forward. At the head of the list is Sakyadhita, or Daughters of the Buddha movement, largely the brainchild of Karma Lekshe Tsomo, who has been a Buddhist nun for over 30 years. In 1997, when Sandy Boucher published her influential book, Opening the Lotus, A Women's Guide to Buddhism, she identified 2 generations of American women Buddhist teachers. Now, more than a decade later, we can add a 3rd generation to that list, and they're making a huge impact on the overall tradition as each generation interpenetrates with the others. Women now wield genuine authority in the North American Buddhist movement. When Diana Eck of Harvard University created a CD-ROM entitled On Common Ground as part of Harvard's Pluralism Project, she noted that female teachers in American Buddhism are creating new organizational forms, enabling them to network with themselves and other Buddhist women worldwide. When I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, two of my fellow Buddhist classmates were Michael Sweet and Leonard Zwilling. During my entire time on campus, I never knew they were a gay couple. To me, they were just Mike and Lenny, great students and great friends. Now, more than 40 years later, they're still together and still swell pals. Much notoriety for lifestyle issues has recently been in the news with respect to California's revolt against the possibility of gay marriage. Nonetheless, the rights of gays, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people are a significant issue in North American culture. And as such, it's no surprise that many members of the self-professed queer community are finding their way into North American sanghas. Before his death, retired Duke University professor Roger Corliss did much to educate the North American Buddhist community about issues critical to the queer community. Now groups like Gay Buddhist Fellowship provide resources that were totally absent just a generation earlier. In his chapter in The Faces of Buddhism in America, Corliss emphasized that in welcoming the queer community into North American Buddhism, we must, 1, create a safe environment in which to practice, 2, create an environment in which practitioners from various traditions can meet, share viewpoints, and be mutually supportive, 3, provide a community that's socially and psychologically supportive, 4, offer compassion through social action, and 5, offer a place to explore the degree to which Buddhism does or does not meet members' spiritual needs. I hopefully look forward to the time, perhaps even in my old lifetime, when such measures will not be necessary and that alternative lifestyles will be welcomed into the mainstream of North American Buddhism. Moving on to social engagement. Back in 1992, Tricycle editor Helen Tworkov said that just now, ours is not predominantly a Buddhism of removed monasticism. It's out of the robes, in the streets, in institutions, workplaces, and homes. It wouldn't be too far a stretch to assume that her statement was an endorsement of what has come to be known socially engaged Buddhism, although I'm sure she didn't know that at the time. I'm not sure if she does now. I'm not a Helen Tworkov fan. Most American Buddhists are aware that the creator of the socially engaged movement is the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. The movement was contrary to the approach that many North American Buddhists had of Buddhism as a socially passive tradition, removed or withdrawn from the rigors of society. Tom Tweed, in his classic book, The American Encounter with Buddhism, even postulated that Buddhism made only tiny inroads into North American culture during the Victorian period for precisely that reason. Yet only a century later, socially engaged Buddhists have combined Buddhist values with distinctly North American forms of social protest, emphasizing peace issues, ecological and environmental concerns, hospice work, prison reforms, and a host of other concerns in an attempt to inject Buddhist-inspired sanity into our dialogue with the planet and with each other. Active social engagement has become so prevalent in defining North American Buddhism that Chris Queen has even suggested that it should become the newest and fourth yana, or vehicle, in the overall Buddhist tradition. In North America, perhaps the greatest advocate of socially engaged Buddhism is the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, a trans-sectarian organization that was founded in 1978 in Hawaii. Now they have chapters in nearly every state in the United States, every province in Canada, and throughout the world. An organization which perhaps rivals the Buddhist Peace Fellowship is Zen Peacemakers Order, founded in 1996 by Bernard Tetsukin Glassman Roshi. Glassman has a long history of social engagement, beginning with the foundation of the Grayston Bakery in 1982. It's now a $6 million business that employs 75 people and has spawned the Grayston Foundation, which, according to the Zen Peacemakers webpage, has become a $13 million, this is their quote, $13 million integrated network of for-profit and not-for-profit entities providing jobs, workforce development, low-income housing, supportive services, childcare, after-school program, comprehensive HIV health care, housing, a gourmet bakery business, and community gardens. That's quite a mouthful. In August of 2010, the Zen Peacemakers sponsored the most comprehensive symposium of North America devoted to socially engaged Buddhism. Engaged Buddhism manifests its worthiness as an ongoing component of the typology that identifies the boundaries of North American Buddhism because it represents a radical revisioning of traditional Buddhist approaches to societal issues. And as it continues to mature, it will help North American Buddhism to move beyond simple dichotomies and divisions so that North American Buddhism is fully interpenetrating and a vital conglomerate that represents the Sangha of the four quarters that Buddha spoke of. Moving on to the last one. More than 30 years ago, when I published American Buddhism, I saved the hardest issue in the volume, that of North American Buddhism's acculturation, for the conclusion. My concern mirrored Emma Lehman's as she asked on the very first page of her introduction to her 1976 book, Buddhism in America, is there a characteristically American style of Buddhism? This is a question that Professor Horry has thrown around quite a bit, and I hope that some of this will reflect a viewpoint that we both share. At the time, I argued that I had made much of the fact that there was a singular relationship between Buddhism's degree of acculturation in its new North American environment and its potential future role in North American religious life. To my way of thinking, there was a clear yardstick by which acculturative growth could be measured, namely the extent to which American Buddhist groups identify with American civil religion. To demonstrate my point, I referred to the work of the leading scholars of American religion at that time, Robert Bellah, Conrad Cherry, and Martin Marty. Nonetheless, I was concerned that the specialists in Buddhist studies, me included, were not well schooled in the intricacies of American religion. And American religion scholars knew precious little about Buddhist studies. In our enterprise, we didn't want to make mediocre generalists out of good specialists. As a result, we relied on pooled interest and methodological dialogue to inform our individual pursuits. In my case, I thought that North American Buddhist groups would be able to participate fully in the North American experience by emphasizing the unique qualities of freedom, equality, and justice, and that it would be also beneficial for North American Buddhist groups to manifest their North American nature in their holiday observances, art, music, ritual life, and so forth. Moreover, I thoroughly disagreed with Emma Lehman when she concluded at the end of her volume that, quote, looking at the various forms in which it manifests itself, it's clear that Buddhism in America does not really have an American style, but appears as an Oriental anachronism in Western society, unquote. While I still disagree with Lehman, by the time Luminous Passage was published 2 decades later, I was not at all sure that I still maintained my original position. When Ken Tanaka and I replaced the term acculturation with the newer phrase adaptation in the Faces of Buddhism in America, it was clear that North American Buddhist communities, and especially Asian immigrant communities, were examining their ritual life, methods of teaching and learning, social organization, and practices in hopes of maintaining their presence on North American soil and extending their future through the ongoing commitment of their children. And that meant increasing their adaptation to North American culture. Some Buddhists, like Victor Horry, were not at all convinced that these accommodations to Americanization process were especially helpful. He suggested, for example, that American Zen had created, in addition to distinct practices, a series of enterprises that Japanese Zen never imagined. Residential communities, businesses, farms, hospices, publishing companies, Dharmacraft cottage industries, and the like. And it's not unreasonable to wonder whether these innovations were a new and important kind of Zen practice or simply a distraction from it. As a result, some Buddhist scholars like Jan Nadir even suggested that it might be valuable to remove some elements of Americanization, just as Chinese Buddhists did in a similar situation in the 4th century of the Common Era. Tanaka, in his epilogue to the Faces of Buddhism in America, suggested that the urgency for aggressive American adaptation had fostered what he called diffuse affiliation and eclectic tendencies. Diffuse affiliation accounted for the possibility of members maintaining concurrent affiliation in more than one Buddhist organization or teachers having received training authorization in more than one tradition. The classic expression of diffuse affiliation can be witnessed in Roger Kamenitz's popular book, The Jew and the Lotus, in which he coined the term Jubu to describe individuals who maintained a Jewish, Buddhist dual affiliation. Eclectic tendencies, on the other hand, was more extreme, in which individuals like Vipassana teachers might even claim no association with the Theravada tradition or even with Buddhism. These approaches might certainly advance the Americanization process of the Buddhist tradition, but at what cost? By the beginning of the new century, North American Buddhism began experiencing a new phenomenon. As part of Harvard's Pluralism Project in 2003, Jeff Wilson presented a published report on the mapping of Buddhist communities in Richmond, Virginia. He noted, quote, "My study seeks to determine how Buddhism has been introduced to Richmond and to what factors are shaping its development. Is there an emerging Buddhist community in Richmond or simply a balkanized set of competing groups? How are Richmond's Buddhists knit into the wider tapestry of Buddhism in the South and on a national level?" Unquote. He went on to say, in addition to the diversity of Buddhist groups in Richmond, one striking phenomenon is a set of lineages that connect most of these groups to one another. Although Wilson didn't use the actual term hybridity, it was clearly intended in its description of the community he was describing. The following year, he presented a paper entitled "There's No Such Thing as Not My Buddhism: Cross-Section Buddhist Hybridity in the American South" at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion in San Antonio. Soon, hybridity became one of the new buzzwords in the study of North American Buddhism. Scholars are now more clearly understanding the linkage and association between adaptation and hybridity in the various forms of North American Buddhism that are emerging and cooperating on the continent. Okay. One of the primary, I don't want to do what Mavis did and say, this is the first time I went over, because it wouldn't be. And I go over a lot. One of the primary advocates of the notion of hybridity for understanding the Western Buddhist tradition has been David McMahon, my former Pennsylvania neighbor, who teaches at Franklin and Marshall College. In a remarkable 2008 volume called The Making of Buddhist Modernism, he made the case for the importance of hybridity in the process of adaptation by saying rather directly, quote, "Through incorporating elements of a new culture and leaving behind irreconcilable ones, traditions inevitably become hybrids of what were already hybrid traditions. This hybridity, however, is not simply a process of weeding out what does not conform to the implicit norms of the new cultural context. It involves a reconfiguration of both tradition and context through contestation and negotiation as much as enthusiastic embrace. The hybridity of Buddhist modernism, therefore, is multifaceted and not reducible to one model." 1 year later, Natalie Quealy picked up the mantle and developed the idea of hybridity in the study of Western Buddhism even more fully in an article titled "Western Self, Asian Other: Modernity, Authenticity, and Nostalgia for Tradition in Buddhist Studies," which was published in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics. Scholars are now more clearly understanding the linkage and association between adaptation and hybridity in the various forms of American Buddhism that are emerging and cooperating in the United States and Canada. And that's why, if you look at the bottom there, I would say it wouldn't be terribly surprising to find that future investigators of adaptation in North American Buddhism relying on what seems to be kind of a fanciful formula. Adaptation plus hybridity plus a little patience equals North American Buddhism. In any case, the context of interreligious and intra-religious hybridity, the issue of adaptation in North American Buddhism, has become not only significantly more complicated, but also more interesting. Moving on to the final bookend, because we've now done the 5 of these, I call this global Buddhist dialogue. The concluding bookend that I proposed in my 1999 typology was ecumenicism. Because I relied heavily on sociologist Peter Berger's claim that pluralistic conditions lead to a market situation in which religious monopolies could no longer take their client communities for granted, and because one of the byproducts of pluralistic situations is ecumenicity, in which religious communication and collaboration occurred among religions and within religions, ecumenicism seemed like a fruitful pathway into North American Buddhist culture. In fairness, I must confess that despite the above, I wasn't the first author to emphasize the value of ecumenicism in American Buddhism. In her 1976 book, Buddhism in America, Emma Lehman says straightforwardly that ecumenicism in American Buddhism was also already taking on several forms, including establishment of non-sectarian or intersectarian churches and monasteries, intersectarian sharing of resources, for example, Sunday school materials and visual aids, exchange of priests and ministers on occasion, integration of meditational type approaches into ceremonial type churches, and joint services involving different sects and or non-Buddhist groups. In each of these ways, Buddhists of different sects do get together in comfortable interaction, coexistence, or union. Although I've never been convinced that the ecumenical Buddhist organizations that have continued on the North American scene have achieved all their admirable goals, in the legacy of the adaptation and hybridity that we just discussed, it now seems important to amend this bookend to include the larger global Buddhist environment. That's why I've called this global Buddhist dialogue. As Buddhism continues to globalize and the study of Western Buddhism has developed into its own vital subdiscipline of Buddhist studies, the advances in technology have enabled North American Buddhist groups to communicate across the regional boundaries in their own continent, but also across continental boundaries as well. This is additionally important because the teaching lineages and communities of important ancient and modern Buddhist teachers have become worldwide enterprises. Global Buddhist dialogue enables modern Western Buddhism to be truly involved in productive boundary crossing. Continental Buddhist organizations like the European Buddhist Union and the American Buddhist Congress can meaningfully see themselves as part of a worldwide Buddhist organization like the World Buddhist Sangha Council or the World Fellowship of Buddhists. In an age of instant travel, North American Buddhists traveling abroad can mouse-click their way through BuddhaNet's World Buddhist Directory and instantly find a community of their own sectarian affiliation in virtually any country on the globe. Better still, because of global Buddhist dialogue, they'll know what to expect, and within the limits of cultural and regional differences in terms of practice, ethical standards, ritual, and so forth. When traveling, they needn't be a Sangha of one. In addition to the inter-Buddhist networking just described, dialogue with other religious traditions is also becoming part of the American Buddhist scene. Professional and practical organizations like the Society of Buddhist Christian Studies are cropping up and presenting an international framework of mutuality in which these organizations unite scholars, practitioners, and practitioners from a variety of traditions. Truly, global Buddhist dialogue helps to unravel the complexities of religious identity in an ever-shrinking but increasingly alienating world. Now, moving on to the last part of the paper, which I call Limping to Nirvana, or reading faster. I've been tracking and studying Buddhism's history and impact here for about 4 decades. And that's probably likely longer than anyone on the planet. Yet the two issues that fueled my initial inquiries still remain. First, is there truly a North American form of Buddhism? And second, how do we understand the Buddhism that's now thriving in North America? Certainly, these two issues have been the main thrust of this address. Nevertheless, it's appropriate to now ask what new issues and features might well impact the ongoing development of Buddhism on the North American continent. Further, it's important to also recognize that the Buddhism that's developing in Canada should not be blindly assumed to be identical to American or Mexican Buddhism. Some of this becomes apparent in Victor Horry's inspiring chapter called How Do We Study Buddhism in Canada in the recently edited volume Wild Geese, Buddhism in Canada. There are the birds again. In addition to what we've already presented above, I think we can add 2 additional developments that will significantly impact both the practice and study of Buddhism in America. On the one hand, there's been a huge development in Buddhist educational institutions on this continent. Here I don't mean only the Buddhist institutions of higher learning like Naropa University, Nyingma Institute, University of the West, and Soka University of America, but also Buddhist high schools and elementary schools, such as the Developing Virtues Secondary School founded by the Dharma Realm Buddhist Association in 1981, or the Pacific Buddhist Academy in Honolulu, founded in 2003. These educational institutions and others will not only contribute to the next generation of Buddhist studies scholars, but will also promote the ongoing development of Buddhist literacy in North America, hopefully providing an abiding legacy for Buddhist children, both for today and the future. On the other hand, just as with Buddhist studies academic community, the influence of technology will be monumental. And to some degree it already has been. Social networking sites make it infinitely easier for Buddhist individuals and communities to establish and maintain contacts with one another, and the web pages of individual Buddhist communities break down the geographic and regional barriers mentioned earlier. Perhaps the technological innovation that may have the biggest impact on the practice of North American Buddhism is the creation of blogs. Some North American Buddhists are already using the creative term Buddhist blogosphere. Several times in this address, I've mentioned the Buddhism Without Borders conference held in Berkeley in March 2010. One of the very best presentations at that event was a paper entitled Finding American Buddhism in Blogs by a journalism professor from the University of Florida named Mindy McAdams. In just a half an hour, she demonstrated how thoroughly blogs had permeated the North American Buddhist landscape. While McAdams rightly notes that it's impossible to calculate how many Buddhist blogs there are because they come and go very quickly, even daily, there are some relatively stable blogs, and they tell us quite a bit on how this new form of instant and far-reaching communication has influenced both the study and practice of North American Buddhism. One of the Buddhist blogs that I follow regularly is established by Reverend Danny Fisher at www.dannyfisher.org. He's a young fellow who earned a BA in 2001, a Master of Divinity degree from Naropa University, and is currently a doctoral student in Buddhist studies at University of the West. In addition to his blog posts, he's also has links highlighting his teachers, causes he supports, his writings, interviews, and social networking communities. But most useful are his incredibly extensive list of internet sites devoted to Buddhist chaplaincy and caregiver sites, engaged Buddhism, publications and forums devoted to Buddhism and Buddhist studies, and Buddhist booksellers and publishers. Without ever once engaging in nasty dialogue, Danny Fisher provides North American Buddhists and Buddhist scholars with one of the most inspiring and useful sites in the entirety of cyberspace. One Buddhist blogger who's in the audience today, named Brooke Shedneck, out in the middle, who's presenting a paper here, makes very clear in her blog called Wandering Dhamma how pervasive the Buddhist blogosphere is. In a post on 19 August 2009, while writing about new trends in Western Buddhists, she remarked, quote, "But it is not only scholars who are contributing to this new dialogue. There is a whole close-knit community thriving on debate and discussion of a diversity of issues almost daily," unquote. And she backs up her claim by listing over 20 blog sites on her blog page, ranging from Tricycle Blog to The Buddha is My DJ, which is not one of my favorite blogs, but Buddha's my DJ. We can talk about that after this. Shedneck's argument is both inspiring and scary to me. Involving practicing North American Buddhists in an ongoing daily dialogue about issues critical to their Buddhist lives and practices would seemingly yield a result that could only be lauded as desirable. On the other hand, because these blogs are generally not moderated, and because those posting notes are not required to present any credentials that might assure accuracy in their statements, there's an enormous margin for error and hostility. And one of the blogs that people look at regularly is called The Angry Buddhist. In the same August 2009 post, she says, this is another long quote, "I think it's clear by now that a new phase of scholarship dealing with Buddhism in Western countries has taken hold. Gone are the days when scholars would list characteristics of a new Western Buddhism such as egalitarianism, feminism, democratization, social engagement, and pragmatism." Another major theme of scholarship from this earlier area created typologies of Buddhist communities such as convert and ethnic Buddhists. I know a number of scholars who stopped being interested in this emerging field because of the reputation of these same typologies and trends within the scholarship. Many people were asking, is there anything new to say about Buddhism in the West? Well, I've put my own response to Brooke's question about whether there's anything new into this little address. Not only have I suggested that Buddhist education and technology will shape the direction of Western Buddhism, but I've amended my initial typology presented in Luminous Passage to reflect new bookends and new issues within each of the 5 categories of my typology. Indeed, I have also repeatedly noted in my work that perhaps the malcontents of North American Buddhist studies should quit whining about old typologies and offer some new and better ones. Brooke, to her credit, seems to have taken up the task of doing just that. She gives us 8 new trends in global Buddhism, and here they are. And I'll just put them out there. I don't think it's my place to comment on them. It's probably your place, but here's what they are. New Age versus hardcore Dharma. Mindfulness meditation and the secularization of meditation. Is Buddhism a religion? The dialogue of Buddhism and science/psychology. Buddhism and youth. Buddhism and pop culture. Buddhism and happiness. Modern-day commentaries of traditional Buddhist teachings. Now, as I said, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on those here, so I'd say this. Now I will wait patiently for colleagues to pick up the mantle and write some hopefully new and insightful dissertations and articles and books on genuinely new trends in Western Buddhism, and to offer some genuinely new workable typologies like that one, instead of simply kicking the old ones to the side of the intellectual road. But by the way, do I think there are new scholars picking up this stuff, or are they simply getting out of the field? Well, I looked around this afternoon at the last panel, and I saw John and Alec and our Theravada Bhikkhu friend and Nicole Liebman, and if you throw in Jeff Wilson and Shannon Hickey and Natalie Quealy and Scott Mitchell, there's just 8 people right off the top of my head that are doing incredibly cool new work on North American Buddhism. So I guess I'm not quite as worried as you are that people are turning off to this. I think it's growing and growing pretty well. In but for the end of this, I'll simply return to my old favorite list of concerns and suggestions for a healthy and vibrant North American Buddhism of the future, despite the fact that these were offered in 1997 by Lama Surya Das, and I will change a couple of them. But here's what he said in 1997. Here was his list of 10 features that he thought were critical for an ongoing, vibrant Dharma. He said, Dharma without dogma, a lay-oriented Sangha, a meditation-based and experiential tradition, I'll change that, gender equality, a non-sectarian tradition, an essentialized and simplified tradition, an egalitarian, democratic, and non-hierarchical tradition. A psychologically astute and rational tradition, an experimental, innovating, inquiry-based tradition, a socially informed and engaged tradition. Of course, I would alter point number 3 so as to include non-meditative traditions like Jodo Shinshu and Soka Gakkai, and point number 5 so as to allow for the integrity of all existing Buddhist sectarian traditions. But I still think this presents the most workable eye to the future we've seen so far. And what better way to end this little presentation than to cite a small fragment of Diana Eck's comment from her On Common Ground CD-ROM. She says, quote, "It is not enough to preserve a religious or cultural heritage. That heritage must also nourish a new generation in a new environment." So I'll stop there.